Okay, we're here to talk about this book, The Gaza Catastrophe, The Genocide in World Historical Perspective, published by Saki Books. And we're very lucky to have with us the author, Gilbert Achcar, who's Emeritus Professor now of Development Studies and International Relations at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London. And he's written extensively on politics and development, economics, as well as social change and social theory. Publications include The Clash of Barbarisms, September the 11th, and The Making of the New World Disorder, which I think has some bearing on what we're going to talk about tonight. It's an absolutely fantastic book. It's been published in 15 languages. He also wrote Perilous Power, the Middle East and US Foreign Policy. That was co-authored with Noam Chomsky. And The People Want a Radical Exploration of the Arab Uprising and Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprisings, and The New Cold War, the United States, Russia and China, from Kosovo to Ukraine. So, the way we're planning to run this is that I'll ask Gilbert some questions to start with, which maybe can help us to unpick some of the main themes of the book. And if I don't ask the right questions, then I think Gilbert will do that anyway. And then we can put the right question. That's what you mean. And then we can open to the audience to have some more difficult questions, maybe. I wanted to start by asking you, and maybe this is a way into thinking about the frame of the book, a phrase that you use quite early on, which I think will resonate for a lot of people, whatever the context, whether we're talking about Gaza or not, which is where you talk about the age of neo-fascism. I wonder whether you could say a bit about that as a frame for the book.
Well, the frame for the genocide, which the book deals with, I think it's obvious to everyone that we are going through a historical period of rise of far-right forces. Every day you listen to the news, you have something about the rise of far-right here and there. With very few defeats, there are some setbacks. Overall, it's, unmissable the fact that you have this global rise of far-right forces, which, I called in an article the age of neo-fascism. Neo-fascism being the reference to the modern form of far-right forces, which are, the key difference being that whereas dictatorship was an open, clear component of old fascist ideology, modern fascism had to adapt to modern times and works within or claim to work with democracy and democratic. So you can have elections. With time, they may be eroded because they will tend, as you can see now in the United States, to try to change the rules of the democratic setting, whatever it is. Anyway, what's the bearing on on the topic of this book? I think it's the fact that Israel has been, unfortunately for the Israelis, but at the vanguard, we could say, of this global movement. The far right actually arrived to power in 1977. Sorry. The far right being the Likud being the heir to the so-called revisionist wing of the Zionist movement. The key figure, which is Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was an admirer of Mussolini, imported imitated a lot of the features of fascism. And the party that represents this legacy, the Likud, first came to power in 1977, Israel, after 30 years, during which the country had mostly been ruled by what we call social democratic wing of Zionism. Those were the years where Israel had the image of being some kind of socialist state with socialist experiences, the kibbutzim and all that. Of course, all this changed radically in time. One key factor was the 1967 war, the new fact of direct occupation of populations that accelerated the right-wing shift, and we get to the first electoral victory of Likud, 1977, and since then, over the something like 46 years that elapsed since then, most of the time have been Likud government, the Likud power, and most importantly, in this wave of when you had this really global wave of neo-fascist rise, which came after the economic crisis, the global economic crisis of 2008, and then the migratory crisis of 2015. These were the events that propelled this. Israel, with Netanyahu power since 2009, was a kind of model for a lot of right-wingers, of this far right. And so this drift to the far right of the Israeli society will reach its peak in the latest government formed by Netanyahu at the end of 2022. He had been in power from 2009 to 2021. Then he was out of it for several months, and then came back at the end of 22 with in coalition with people for whom even the label neo-fascist doesn't fit, because they are really neo-Nazis, as an Israeli scholar called them in Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper. They are really neo-Nazis, and Vir and Smotrich, with these guys, if they could, they would just get rid of all Arabs between the river, from the river to the sea, and also get rid of any democratic pretense. That's it. So you had this government in power when October 7 happened. And therefore, this is a factor definitely in the implementation of the genocide.
Excuse me, I think the microphone would help. If that's all right, because probably the air conditioning is quite loud.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hold the on button for a little bit.
Okay. So just to say that the fact that we have what is, I would say, the most, the furthest or the most far right-wing, the most rightist, far-rightist government of any elected government in the world today, this coalition of neo-fascists and neo-Nazis that is ruling Israel. The fact that you have them in power is definitely a key factor in the way the war happened and was conducted. Right? Even though I would add at the same time that there is a genocidal potential that is inherent in the very nature of the Israeli state or the Zionist project as a settler colonial project. I mean, colonialism in general has genocidal potential in the sense of the dichotomy between civilized and barbarians and the dehumanization of the colonized, which opens the way to the possibility of genocide. Speaking of potential, of course, not all colonial experiences were based on genocide. And even more so when you have settler colonialism, with big cases of history of settler colonialism were linked to genocide. And so the nature of the project in Israel was such that this potential existed, I would say, from the start, but in order to reach realization of the potential, you needed some political changes, which happened with this drift to the far right, getting to the extreme. And this coincided very unfortunately with the October, the 7th of October attack, which I describe in the book as the most catastrophic miscalculation in the history of anti-colonial struggles, which is a way of putting it where it belongs to, that is anti-colonial struggles, not Nazi anti-Semitism as it was portrayed. But and there have been, I give an example in the book, such cases in the history of anti-colonial struggles, as in Angola, 1961, very similar. But it was an absolutely catastrophic miscalculation. I mean, regardless of course, let's say the war crimes that were committed on that day, but the key issue is that from a strategic perspective, it's almost irrational to launch such an operation when you know that you are risking. I mean, the belief that they probably had that the outcome would be different is, in my view, inseparable from the religious dimension of their thinking. Somewhat magical thinking of a religious kind.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's what you say in the book. I mean, you refer to Hamas as being infused with a religious type of magical thinking that's characteristic of this kind of movement. So we are facing a situation at the moment in Britain where to give any support for Hamas is illegal. We'll be arrested if we say we support Hamas. And I suppose one of the effects of that is not so much a problem for many of us personally, because we've never supported Hamas, but it is a problem politically in being able to have an open discussion about the character of Hamas. And one of the things that marks out your analysis is that you have no time for Hamas on a very, very critical level.
Yes, but at the same time, it is really scandalous that in Western countries, what is regarded as apology of terrorism, which would be an apology of not an apology, a defense of the Palestinian rights, is what is repressed, whereas the apology of the much, much, much larger state terrorism and even genocide perpetrated by the Israeli state is found much less problematic. And that's the most striking thing, this double standard that is today absolutely obvious, that has different causes. Of course, one of them is the Holocaust and the memory of that, which played a role, which was very much exploited by the Israeli state, and still is very much. But that's not the only one. And there are various factors, strategic factors, up to even things that probably speak more to your specialty than to mine, what they call narcissistic compassion.
And he's talking about psychoanalysis.
Yeah. So yeah. But this being said, I refuse this kind of obligation to choose between either one kind of position or the very reverse in defending anything that happens on the Palestinian side. As I said, I mean, the difference is that, as it's my critique of Hamas, first of all, is not at all putting it in a kind of genealogy that goes back to Nazism, as is very commonly done. October 7, in all the Western countries, was described as the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, right? This is a way of putting it in a kind of direct affiliation with Nazism and with the Holocaust. As if, these guys who did October 7 did that just because of hatred of Jews, just because they had some anti-Semitic, irrational, or whatever it is, fantasy belief like the one that was behind the genocide in European history, and did that for only that reason. Whereas, for any kind of sensible observer, it is obvious that the parallel or the analogy between a territory under occupation, the fact in international law, Gaza was under occupation even before its re-invasion by the Israeli army. A territory under strangulation, a territory under terrible oppression with periodic bombings, thousands of people killed over the years, deprived of a lot of issues, and you have an organization within this territory which goes into completely disproportionate, against a far stronger enemy and attack them. And to say, well, the parallel is between the Nazis attacking the Jews is absurd. If you wanted to make a parallel of a disproportionate attack, I did that. People were crying, but I did it only from the point of view of the fact that it was hopeless and disproportionate. It would have been the Warsaw Ghetto facing the Nazi army. They had absolutely no hope of getting through with that. So in that case, the Nazi analogy is particularly absurd. If you ask yourself, if you want to make analogies, what is closer to Nazism? An ultra-far right government of a state occupying the territories with populations under its thumb, under its control and oppression. Is this closer to Nazism or the government, whatever it is, that is in a territory that is under occupation and oppression? So, this analogy I refuse, but at the same time, as I said, within the understanding of the right to resist against oppression and the right to resist against occupation, it's in international law even. within this understanding, I'm saying it is catastrophic miscalculation. That is, from the point of view of the rationality of the struggle. It's a right is one thing. The implementation, the ways of implementing that right are different, and there are ways of implementing a right that can be completely counterproductive. And here is a textbook case of a completely counterproductive action that led to a real disaster.
I mean, there's a kind of little trap that often we fall into as well, which is to equate the barbarism of the two sides. And it reminds me of the analysis that you gave in your book, The Clash of Barbarisms, where you talk about that complementary relationship between imperialism and the enemy that it searches out in Afghanistan, the production of this Islamic enemy in its fantasy, and then effectively in reality. And I suppose in the current context, that resonates with the way that you talk about the relationship between the Israeli state and Hamas. You talk about the relationship as being one of functional complementarity. Yeah, that in a way, the Israeli right requires Hamas as its enemy in order to function.
Yes, true. I mean, the Clash of Barbarisms that you are alluding to was written after September 11, 2001. So that was the thing that, and I was saying that the barbarism of imperialist powers produces a counter-barbarism on the other side, but not all barbarisms are equal. That is that of the poor and weak and oppressed. In terms of moral responsibility, it falls on the strongest. It's not on the weakest. And so you have a range of positions, from the position that is just blaming Hamas and justifying what the Israeli state is doing in the name of right to self-defense, which would mean actually, to start with, that there is a right for the occupier to defend itself against the occupied. I mean, that's of course very debatable. So you have the range of positions starting from this, going through those who would, dismiss both, right? That is, well, both sides are. And even that is a big problem, because the disproportion is absolutely blatant, absolutely obvious between whatever happened on October 7. You had 1,200 people killed on the Israeli side. On the very same day, among the attackers, you had 1,600 dying. I mean, who died there. And then now we are at 70,000 people killed. And this is the figure of just those direct death by bombing. According to estimates, usually the indirect deaths are several times more, the range being between 4 and 15 times the number of direct deaths. Indirect deaths are particularly high in this specific case because of the early destruction of all the health infrastructure by the bombing, very deliberately. From the start, the blockade on food, fuel, electricity, such means, and the intensity of the bombing in one of the most densely populated spots on Earth, which is Gaza. So when we'll get a final figure of the whole number of deaths that are attributable to those 2 years of bombing, presuming that it has stopped, which hasn't, which is still not really the case. But the number will vary, maybe in the 250,000, more, probably more than 10% of the population. So it's absolutely a huge massacre, which is why also it's, since it was deliberate, it perfectly preserves the or fits the legal definition of genocide. Yeah. So yes, I mean, I disagree with those who try to defend October 7 by trying to explain that it achieved some successes. I even had in one of such of meetings like this someone who told me, well, thanks to October 7, we can now say, everybody can now see that the Israeli state is genocidal. So I told this person, are you realizing what you're saying? So you're happy that a genocide happened so that you can say that the state is genocidal. This is appalling.
So I've read you somewhere else writing that the really huge movement, Palestine movement, that's developed over the last 10 years has developed despite the October 7th attacks, not because of
exactly, because people forget that the initial weeks after October 7, the public opinion in Western countries, the sympathy was the Israelis, not one with the Palestinians at the very beginning. But the viciousness and violence of the Israeli onslaught on Gaza has been such that it has progressively changed the public opinion, starting with young people mobilizing here and there. And you had a shift in that regard. And it has been so appalling that the shift affected the constituency that you would have believed, or people would have believed, to be the most pro-Israeli outside, which is American Jews. And that's where you have the most important Jews. And it's an amazing thing that you have such a shift in attitudes of American Jews who are, who are increasing proportion is very critical of the Israeli state and openly in polls proclaim sympathy for the Palestinians. And that's even more the case among young Americans, where you have a majority of them expressing sympathy for the Palestinians and rejection of what Israel is doing. 40% of American Jews describe what has been going on in Gaza as genocide, which is a higher proportion probably than most Western public opinion polls would give you. So yes, these are. This is a product of the reality of the genocide and the fact that even if at first narcissistic compassion, which is compassion with those that are like you, and the lack of compassion with those who are unlike you, fortunately, it has its limits. That is, there is ground to believe in the humanity of people, and when people see such treatments, when they see kids and all that suffering, all that they have been suffering in Gaza, they end up drawing the right lesson here and blaming the oppressor, not the oppressed.
I want to ask you a little bit about resistance and violence because you have a very interesting section of the book where you say the key to the mindset behind Hamas's action is to be found in Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, best known interpretation of the feelings of the colonized by a political thinker who was also a psychiatrist. I can't resist asking you this question. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, you read the book. I quote a section of The End of the Earth, and it is strikingly similar. He speaks of the colonized dreaming of erupting into the colonizers' cities and all that, and the mindset that he describes, is a key to understanding, if you want, what happened on October 7, when you had up to 5,000 or something like this of people throwing themselves in this in the unknown, taking high risk, and they said 1,600 of them died on the spot. But that was for them an opportunity to take revenge, if you want, of such a long oppression. Bear in mind also that Gaza, the vast majority of the population of Gaza are 1948 refugees. That is, people who had to leave those territories that Israel conquered in 48, 49, and were never allowed to come back. I mean, they fled the war, they fled terrorist act and the rest, but they were never allowed to come back. And they lived, for many of them, in very miserable conditions, in camps, and all that. And so just imagine what such population may, and Fanon indeed, in his analysis of the mindset of the colonized, gives really is a great interpreter of that. And it's really striking how the paragraph that I quoted fits what happened on October 7th.
Okay, I want to open up to the audience just in a minute, but I have a last question, which is something that we already rehearsed in the talk that you just gave in the university, which is a point that we ended up on. And you have a sentence in the book which repeats what you said in that lecture just now, which was on the Arab Spring. No. Yes, which was on the Arab Spring. But the quote was, "There's no room for optimism in the face of all this." People who weren't at that seminar might want to hear where you go if there's no optimism.
Yeah, what I was saying is that I drew a distinction, which in my view is very important, between optimism, which is the belief in that the best scenario will happen, and hope, which is just the belief that there is a possibility and potential, but there is no certainty at all in that potential being realized. And everybody knows the famous formula about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. There's something missing in that formula, which is hope. Because, if you have pessimism of the intellect, you can't have optimism of the will without hope, right? Because if you have no hope and you are pessimistic, optimism of the will is just impossible. And yes, we are in the whole part of the world, the Middle East is in terrible conditions. The foreseeable future is really bleak. You already have a present which is terrible. So the future that can come out of the existing conditions is frightening. You have civil wars and all that. You have a genocide, you have oppression, you have all kinds of wars. And with the general direction into which the whole world is going, this age of neo-fascism, is the kind of government you have today in the United States of America, which in a sense is worse than what you had in between the two world wars, when the United States and Britain remained out of the fascist sphere. Now it's the United States that is leading that. So, I mean, under all these conditions, there's no room for optimism. And when you come to the region, even less so. But the most important factor of hope that I see is linked to my understanding that there is no rational strategy, given the balance of forces, for the Palestinian struggle that doesn't work to split the Israeli society, to win over a majority of the Israeli society into rejection of the occupation, of oppression, and all that. And it's a matter of even balance of forces. There are conditions, even if I take my own country, Lebanon, from Lebanon. I think the armed struggle made sense in Lebanon against the Israeli occupation army. The geographic conditions, the general conditions of that were there, and it made sense. And there was a possibility of having this army withdraw, which happened. And the country was invaded in 1982. Then the occupation remained in the south of the country until 2000. But in 2000, under the pressure of guerrilla attacks and the rest, when they saw that the price to pay to hold on to this strip of territory was too high, they withdrew. So that made sense, right? But in the case of the Palestinians between the river and the sea, first of all, there's no way the Israeli army will withdraw to somewhere. Secondly, it is, I mean, the balance of force is such that there's, I mean, to thinking of liberating Palestine by armed struggle seems to me to be just a fantasy, if you, or I would say irrational. So you need, in such circumstances, you need to split the oppressor society. You can give examples in that regard, but I would say that even in a situation where you had conditions for liberation war, like Vietnam, the Vietnamese leadership always knew how to address the American population. And that was a key concern for them to, and the anti-war movement in the United States is what eventually led to the United States withdrawing. It wasn't defeated militarily, but the rise of the anti-war movement in the United States created such a moral crisis in the U.S. Society, and even in the U.S. Military, the consulate and all that, draftees, that was the key factor that led the United States to leave Vietnam. Now, if you take a kind of struggle where the balance of forces is closer to what we're discussing, as I said, if you take the black population in the United States, I mean, it is through the civil rights movement, which, of course, involved white people and an increasing segment of the white population, that the movement succeeded. It's not through those attempts at doing some kind of armed struggle with the Black Panthers, which was not even an armed struggle, but some violent forms. This went nowhere. because it's not adapted to the circumstance. So it's just to say that I wouldn't describe myself as a pacifist or a non-violent or a Gandhist. It's not that. It's a matter of strategic thinking. And the Palestinians, therefore, given all the factors that I mentioned, need to be able to split the Israeli society. And what Hamas is doing leads to exactly the contrary. And here, I get back to what we were saying, that there's an interaction between this drift to the right of the Israeli society, the increasing drift to the right, especially after the year 2000, and the rise of Hamas, already I don't want to get into too many details. The key point is that Netanyahu, before him Sharon, they benefited from these periodic bouts of violence, those rockets or whatever sent by Hamas, because that allowed them to stir up the nationalist feeling and support for their kind of policies. And yes, so where did we start from? Optimism. Yeah, so exactly, that's the point. So the factor of hope, that I see, is the shift among the American Jewish population. Given the connections between the American Very population and the Israeli population, and given, of course, the very tight relation and dependence, actually, of Israel on the United States, this is a decisive factor for the future. And whereas the Israeli society has kept drifting to the right, the most recent polls were frightening. Of course, as a result also of the shock of October 7, which very much radicalized in the wrong direction the minds of people. But the point is there that whatever movements there were in the 80s and 90s that developed into a critique of the occupation and the rest, so that they were indicative of potential of critique of Zionism, and you have the rise among intellectuals of some of what was called post-Zionism, people even rejecting the definition of the Jewish state and saying, we don't want that, we want a state for all its citizens, and the rest. That is what was called post-Zionism. Now, you had since then, since the turn of the century, a terrible setback, and this setback has been amplified tremendously by October 7. So if you look at Israeli society today, there's really no ground for any of this. It's really very, very worrying. But the American factor that I mentioned is something that can, in the future, have very important consequences. So we'll have to see. So there is a reason for hope, but no reason for optimism for now.
Okay, thanks. That was a very long answer to the short question. But maybe we should open up to the audience now. Maybe take things further. I can see one hand. Go.
Yeah, I think this is sort of continuing really from what Gilbert's been saying, which is if there is a move towards neo-fascism.
Can everyone hear this?
If there's a move towards neo-fascism, it's an important dimension of that is I think you used the phrase in the book, decadence of liberalism. And the thing that, obviously we have this extremely right-wing Israeli government supported by, the United States, Britain and so on. But there is a phenomenon called liberal Zionism. Now, you know, what is the critique of liberal Zionism, or should it be as potent as the critique of the current Israeli government? Because a lot of these American Jews who may have fallen out of love with Netanyahu and his government, nonetheless would, in some broad sense, be liberal Zionists. And as you and Elon Pape and others have shown, there is this fundamental contradiction in the Zionist project itself, whether it's liberal, whether it's right-wing, whatever sort of ideological coating it comes in. And that contradiction is irresoluble unless, you know, the state of Israel, as currently constituted and has been since the late 40s, is actually dismantled and replaced by something else. So, I mean, I'm something of a pessimist. I mean, I look for grounds for hope, but I think the Zionist project itself, including the liberal Zionist versions of it, which we are exposed to in this country through Jonathan Friedland, for example, writing in The Guardian, you know, that is not resoluble within, you know, any imaginable universe.
Yeah, I mean, liberal Zionism is a species in extinction, basically. And that is I'll say, the natural result of the contradiction that you mentioned. There is a tension between the values of liberalism, speaking of philosophical and political liberalism, not speaking economic neoliberalism, but I'm speaking of liberalism in general, and the colonial enterprise in the Zion. It's like also liberal imperialism. In the end, there's a tension, right? And I mean, you had a liberal, or let's say, what could be seen as general liberalism with Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt also played a key role in the whole set of institutions that came out of the Second World War were, you know, designed on what has been called the liberal international order, the liberal rules-based international order. And very quickly, this was completely violated by the United States itself, which was the key godfather of the system, of this, and the excuse for that was the Cold War, struggle against communism, totalitarianism, blah blah blah. That during the whole period of the Cold War, and then you had the end of the Cold War. And you had a revival of this liberal pretense, and a number of even institutions, new institutions created, like the International Criminal Court, which was created in the 90s after the Cold War. And that in turn actually very quickly was betrayed and violated by none other than the United States, which after speaking, was mentioned, but that's also in Barbarisms, in 1990, the famous speech of Bush 1, not Bush 2, on the New World Order, 1990, saying we are entering a New World Order and the Soviet Union was collapsing, in which the rule of law will dominate and the weak will be supported against the strong and things like this. And then quite quickly, by the end of the decade, 1999, the United States started circumventing this rule of law. I mean, the Kosovo, which circumvented the Security Council, the UN Security Council, and then, most importantly, the invasion of Iraq by Bush II. in 2003. So the violations were there, and we got into a new Cold War, which is the topic of my previous book, which reached a peak with the invasion of Ukraine. But the coincidence between Ukraine and Gaza brought this hypocrisy of the liberal discourse and the double standard that's inherent to it to a historical peak. I mean, at no time was it so blatant and so obvious as it has been with the simultaneity of the Russian war in Ukraine and the Israeli war in Gaza, right? And the difference in attitude is absolutely obvious, absolutely striking. And this betrayal by the liberals of their own principles, this reaction of those who are supposed to be liberals to the rise of neo-fascism by adapting to it, as we see very much in this country. To mention the last things about refugees is just absolutely appalling. Shabana Mahmoud's project and all that. They have been actually facilitating the rise of the far right. And you can see it also in the position of Joe Biden, who's a Democrat, not Trump. But it is Joe Biden that created the conditions for the return of Donald Trump. And his, to use the way Kamala Harris put it in her memoirs, his inability to show empathy to the population of Gaza, she said, well, played an important role in her defeat, in the defeat of the Democrats, because of the attitude of many of the voters. And and we see that all the time. So this was illustrated long ago in Israeli politics. And yes, I think one of the effects of the genocide is many of those who could have been described in the past as liberal Zionists became much more critical of Israel and of Zionism. But those forces that in Israel are called centrist are actually right-wing forces. And the Israeli opposition is in no way an anti-war opposition or whatever, or more peaceful than the present government. On the contrary, they for instance, the key leader of the opposition tried to outflank Netanyahu on the issue of Iran, that he shouldn't have stopped the war. I think that. So yeah, it's not any revival of this kind of policies that will, there is no hope. If the term hope is appropriate, but I don't think that this, we really need something else.
Hi, thank you for a very clear and inspiring talk. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I don't want to ambush you with a sort of unfair or inappropriate question, but but I'm very, very struck by the difference between what you're saying and a talk I went to on Saturday. So I'd be interested to know if you had any comments. So on Saturday, Norman Finkelstein was here, and he, in South Manchester, and he spent an hour or two building a case that a valid analogy for what happened in Gaza was Nat Turner's slave revolt.
Excuse me?
Nat Turner's slave revolt. And so that was a useful analogy, a suitable analogy. But as at the end of 2 hours or something, his conclusion was that it was premature to say that the October the 7th uprising was either stupid or is another word like irresponsible, too premature. Using that analogy, and that's in the slavery revolt, and how that then inspired others. It was terribly brutal at the time and disastrous, seemingly disastrous, but that then inspired others, like abolitionists like John Brown, and therefore it was premature to conclude October the 7th was a disaster. So I'd really like to comment on.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could share that kind of belief, but first of all, there's a big difference between the kind of revolt that was referred to and the organized attack by a group which has been ruling a territory since 2007, and which had every possible reason to believe that the result of its action would be disastrous, right? I'll give you just in the year 2006, Hezbollah in Lebanon abducted 2 Israeli soldiers. Israel launched a war which destroyed, flattened, basically large sections of the areas where the political constituency of Hezbollah was based, right? That was terrible. And the general secretary of Hezbollah, who was assassinated at the end of last year, made a famous statement by the end of that, saying, if I had known that the Israeli reaction would be so brutal, and I wouldn't have authorized this operation. Okay. So when you launch something on the scale of 7 October, which is far larger than this cross-border operation that Hezbollah, what do you expect? Of course, what do you expect coming from a state like the State of Israel, and even more so when you have the far right in government. So that's therefore this analogy doesn't work. And then saying it's too early. Look, you have already a genocide, right? That's for me is already enough to say that it is a catastrophe. That's why the title. Okay, it is a catastrophe. It's worse than the Nakba. You didn't have a genocide during the Nakba. You had a high number of people killed, but not something that you could fit in the legal definition of genocide. You had ethnic cleansing, of course, on very large scale. But this here, you had a terrible genocide. You had a population suffering absolutely awful conditions for 2 years, and still with absolutely no clarity about their future and all that. And to say, it's too early to know what's the outcome is really, again, don't want to blame to interpret something that I didn't attend, but I don't think that you can say that jury is still out or something. No, it's obviously a disaster, and just look at what it led. Now, this kind of neo-colonial resolution voted by the United Nations Security Council, which is even in the history of the United Nations, that shows the decay of liberal institutions. It's the United Nations. It's probably one of the worst resolutions ever in the history of the United Nations. If you look at the very logic of the resolution, this idea of putting Gaza under the control of some kind of neo-colonial board of peace chaired by Donald Trump in person, and the rest. So no, it's a major setback for the Palestinian struggle. The conditions are clearly worse for the struggle on the ground than they were before. The West Bank, we are speaking of Gaza, but the West Bank, you have more incremental but very real increase of settler violence against them. Every day you can read that. So the whole condition for the Palestinians is worse than it has ever been. That's a fact, and I think undisputable fact. Now you have had a movement, a solidarity movement rising, and all that. Well, that's, if you want, the silver lining, but in a otherwise disastrous, completely disastrous landscape. So,
Yes, thank you very much. My question is also related to your question. You mentioned it at the end of this response now, but you said you find hope in seeing American Jews changing their perspective. I find hope in seeing Italian workers going on strike, general strike, stopping everything for Palestine. How did that happen? I see hope in seeing the global summer flotilla. I see hope in millions of people protesting every week for Palestine for the past two years. Where do you see that?
well, all this is good, definitely, but it will bear little impact, I'm afraid, on Israel. And the real influence on Israel is the United States. Everybody knows. I mean, whatever European states, they say, and first of all, they don't agree among themselves and all, and still, I mean, you have only Ireland and Spain acknowledge the reality of the genocide. All the other governments are genocide deniers when it comes to Gaza. So that's why I'm saying the United States, that's where the shift in public opinion is the most important. And when I specify the American Jews, it is for the impact on the Israeli society. Yeah, I mean, whatever happens, for instance, among Germans won't affect the Israelis. But if it happens among American Jews in particular, Americans in general, American Jews in particular, this has very direct consequences. And that's why I say that the key ray of hope for the future. But other than that, really, at the level of governments, this Emmanuel Macron type of thing of state of Palestine, suddenly realizing that this thing that was proclaimed in 1988, and that since then a vast majority of UN members had recognized, France and others have just recognized now, when it's in some way to sense. You have this pressure for a Palestinian state, but what do they mean by Palestinian state, all these people? And since they rely upon Donald Trump to implement, to put pressure on the Israelis to do, it's a completely wrong state. It's even worse than, even the Mahmoud Abbas, the Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority, which has less sovereignty than, for instance, the French Vichy government had under Nazi occupation. They have less sovereignty than the French. They are completely under, and yet Israel does not accept this Palestinian Authority. The Israelis want something even more subdued to what they want. And that's one of the conditions that they have put now in this UN resolution, that the Palestinian Authority should be reformed in the way that pleases Israel, right? In order for a pathway to possible statehood may become. I mean, it's that is even this completely wrong idea of a so-called state that would be just and completely under Israeli control. Even this is just put as a possible hypothesis, provided this and this happens. So, yeah, this.
Okay, we're at 8:15, but maybe we can take one more question since you've just put your hand up when I was going to say that.
I mean, it's more about the regional politics, because it seems to me that I agree with you. Hamas leadership surely didn't, they bit off more than they could chew. It was a strategic blunder. I just have to imagine that they anticipated getting more support from their fellow travelers, Hezbollah. It turned out that Israel quite easily dispatched these groups and then was suddenly facing Iran. And it seems like that is where I guess the question is there a regional shakeup? You have this quasi-rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Is that really significant? And can Israel really sustain this, having, Netanyahu visited troops that are now stationed permanently in Syria? They're bombing Lebanon on a daily basis. Sure, maybe militarily they can do this, but can a society really sustain that without breaking down or just being completely exhausted and collapsing? And it seems like they've managed within the region. I mean, is this rapprochement significant between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
No.
Yes, it's making a big deal. He's in Washington now.
No, it's not.
$1 trillion deals.
And there's a lot of hypocrisy in that. Like the distancing of the Saudis from the Israeli onslaught on Iran, which was the last one joined by the United States. But at the bottom, they are very happy. Reality is they don't want to take positions that would antagonize Iran openly because they fear Iran taking measures, against them. But they were definitely happy. Trump just said it in some way when he said that the crown prince visiting him, he said, well, they are very happy with everything we did in the region. Yeah. So that includes, of course, the strike on Iran. That showed that we can protect them, right? That's what is needed. So Iran suffered definitely a major defeat, and that added to the triumphalism of Israel. Israel today is stronger at the regional level than it has been for long, at least since 97. The things are, and the fact that the environment is in decomposition. You have fragmentation, like you have in Syria and the rest. Israel managed to destroy, decapitate Hezbollah. Hezbollah is very much weakened. It's not dead yet, but it is very much weakened. There's no doubt about that. The Assad regime collapsed because of the inability of Iran to keep supporting it. And Iran itself was dealt a very heavy blow. And it's hesitating between capitulation and trying they haven't yet defined a clear policy as a result of all that. So you have a number of things of this kind. But let me add about the region I mentioned. The fact that even on the Palestinian issue, there is a lot of hypocrisy of those Arab states. They are completely complicit in the genocide because they had the means to stop it. And the means to stop it is, well, their fabulous oil and gas resources and their fabulous capital, money resources. Had they, banged on the table from the start, had they even threatened to organize an oil boycott, as they did in 1973 in support of Egypt and Syria at the time, things would have changed. Israel would not have been able to carry on. Had they gone into Arab oil producers boycott of all states supporting Israel, which would have been actually starting with boycotting the United States, but all the rest, this would have created such a mess in the global economy that the pressure on Israel to stop would have been certainly unbearable, very, very, very high, very early on. They didn't even threaten this time of doing that. And so, in that sense, they are directly complicit in this genocide. What Donald Trump is very much trying to do is his Abraham courts, as he likes to call them, is to kind of formalize some kind of regional system of U.S. allies, including Israel and the Gulf states as the key pillars. That's what he's missing. And he looks at Israel, and so do those states, like the Saudi Kingdom. They see Israel as an antidote to whatever threat may arise against them from the other side. So you had Nasser's Egypt in the 60s, and that was dealt a very heavy blow in 1967 in Israel. And you had Iran, and again. So that's what I'm saying. They're happy with what happened. And ultimately, that's the key point. I mean, what these states represent is even more important for the United States itself than Israel. Israel's value is mostly that of an ally, strategic ally, in the defense of these interests that are embodied above all in those rich oil states, which were actually designed as states, even in their borders and all that, by British imperialism, and then US imperialism took over in order to exploit their resources and deprive the populations of the region from these resources, because most of these states are completely artificial, would not have existed without Britain.
Robert, go on.
Sorry, just to follow up to that question, Gilbert. But isn't that analysis, which is, I think, feels very persuasive, isn't that indicating that there is some hope there, because those strategic position of those states, if they were to shift, and obviously that's a big if, then the US might decide that its strategic interests in using Israel were actually now outweighed by the possible deficits. So, in other words, it could tilt, and the US could shift its position. I know there's a long way to go for that, but
I don't understand what you mean.
Well,
how do you want them to shift?
Because
even if it's just
because the US could use, instead of using Israel as its strategic partner to manage the region, could shift to one or more of the states you've mentioned under pressure. Obviously, not currently with with their current regimes. But if those were, and it's a bit like the way things, this is too easy an analogy with South Africa. So I say that with some caution, but there was a point, South Africa, a nuclear power, very, very powerful, used in the region by its imperialist supporters, and they shifted away. So isn't there a possible pivot? It's a long way off, but isn't there a possible ray of hope?
Well, if the United States shifts away from Israel, of course, that would signal the beginning of the end for the Israeli state. I mean, which has been so much dependent on this relation, which wasn't from the start, and by the way. It's just in the 60s, late 60s, that this strategic relation between the United States and Israel was built up. And since then, it has been a very crucial structural factor, structural dependence of Israel towards the United States. So, hypothetical scenarios, you can draw a lot. You can also ask me, well, after the depletion of oil, what will happen? The value of Israel in American eyes of the United States will certainly go down because the region as a whole would be less interesting. But to be frank, as we see things now, these states, if you have an upheaval in these states, then Israel would be there along the United States to try to put it down, to quell it. And if you're thinking of a shift in their policies on this issue, I don't think this can happen. These are very right-wing states, very reactionary governments, there's nothing that can really create in them a real sympathy for the Palestinian people. They don't give a damn. Palestinian people, they are afraid of the impact of what happened to the Palestinians on their own population and therefore on the stability of their rule. So that applies to the Saudis in particular, not the Emiratis, again, because they are very artificial states. But the Saudis, they are a rainbow states. And that's why they haven't joined this Abraham Accord. And that's why they put this condition of a Palestinian state as a precondition for the establishment of direct relation between them and Israel. But again, what they want is this kind of rump state that is in the plans of Trump. Actually, in 2020, during his first mandate, Trump already produced what he called at the time the deal of the century, right? And that was something that even the Palestinian Authority of Ramallah rejected. Said, "Oh, this is unfair, unjust. We refuse your plan." Now this plan has been incorporated in the UN resolution. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah? The only state that okayed that plan was Israel. And that's one of the oddities of this UN resolution, was treat the occupier and the perpetrator of genocide as a major reference for its action in the region.
Okay, we're up to 8:30. We didn't think we'd get here, but we are. And I don't know whether Gilbert knows this yet, but the bookshop would like you to sign some books. Okay, good. Okay, so let's thank Gilbert, and then you can get on with it.